Super.
Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I am joined by Catherine Dunne, who I do movement medicine with. Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Hi, Jane. I'm very well. Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Yeah, it's very
exciting.
Thank you for joining me. So, Catherine, before we get into discussing a wide range of things, maybe you can tell me a bit about yourself, please.
Sure. So I started off my career as a counseling psychologist, which is almost 30 years ago now, and spent a lot of that first sort of 10, 15 years of my professional life working at community level in London initially, and then here in Cork. Became a supervisor and a trainer of other therapists, and expanded out into a modality called movement medicine, which is an embodied movement practice, which you have some experience of. And in more recent years have expanded out again into a modality called Ancestral Lineage healing work. And my work has been about really the power of relationship and exploring the healing power, and the process of empowerment that coming into relationship with oneself and strengthening our capacity to be in relationship with one another. And in more recent years, really also coming into relationship with our environment, the world around us, remembering those from whom we have descended, expanding our sense of what and whom we are in relationship with.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So this series has covered many, many different topics that I believe are interconnected. So things like attachment and neurodevelopment, but also the social determinants of health and racism, and you mentioned environmental issues as well. Are these topics, or do they come up in the therapy room for you, Catherine?
For sure. I mean, often when people think of therapy, they think of, oh, well, what's my personal problem, issue, block? And of course, that's a lot of what we do in the therapy room. At the same time, each individual issue sits within a context that's much bigger. The themes that have come down, we speak intergenerational trauma is very acknowledged now in psychology and in neuroscience even. So that's really ancestral work.
Right.
That's an ancestral context. Economic issues such as migration. My own parents left Ireland as young people and went to the US as economic migrants. That has had a huge influence on me and my life story, having been born in what wasn't the land that my people came from and then returning. So everything sits in a context. And from that point of view, the micro and the macro, I think it behooves us to not try and divorce them.
Yes.
To include them, whether in the therapy room or in fact, as you speak to in policy.
Yeah, one of the books that I really liked as part of my PhD research was Sandy Bloom's Creating Sanctuary, and how she described, her focus was mainly on America, but she said we live in a trauma organized world. And she mentioned the immigrant experience in the States and how that is a massive rupture to identity and to the homeland, but also then the conquering of the Native Americans and everything that happened there, slavery and all these unprocessed wounds, really. Some people might think that's over-egging it to use that word, but are there all these wounds out there that we do need to work through individually and perhaps collectively?
Yeah, I think it's a great inquiry. My simple answer is yes. My more nuanced answer, I think, is, and this is, I think, important in the context of trauma in general, deciding we're going to address trauma without enough resource
Right.
is a real recipe for re-traumatization. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
word trauma is very, for good reasons, charged and present in our current dialogues.
Mm.
I often these days replace it with overwhelm.
Right.
Because that's really what happens in trauma. It's just too much.
Mm.
Too much, too fast, too soon, right? Those are the components
Mm.
where we get overloaded in a way that we find ourselves in something we're not able to cope with, stay present with, digest. And so something freezes in order to enable us to keep going. When we decide we want to, when we become aware of this and want to address these things, as is happening beautifully around the world at many levels at the moment, the danger is we just decide we need to go at it, but we don't spend enough time or have enough awareness or enough understanding to take the time to get resourced enough,
Mm-hmm.
to get what we need to even begin to take the lid off something, because that lid was put on for good reason. It was too
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
So I'm all for taking off the lid, but if we're going to take off the lid and just get re-overwhelmed or reactivated
Mm.
and repeat something,
Mm.
um, I'm not sure that we're going to get the benefits we seek.
Mm-hmm.
So for me and in my work, I give a lot of attention to how do we get resourced? If I want to deal with this, that, or the other, how do I hold myself? I was going to stay steady, but it's how do I stay moving and breathing through that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the irony is in that, in getting more resourced, we are resolving trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because trauma is when we don't have enough resource.
Mm.
So by simply orienting to getting more resourced, we start that healing process, I believe, whether
Mm.
individually or as a community,
Okay.
as a
Yeah,
collective.
it's a very, very interesting point. And by resources, is it mainly an internal coping mechanisms, or to do with a felt sense of safety around other people? Or what do you mean by that, Catherine? Can you expand a little?
Sure, great question. I think there are a lot of different layers to it. First and foremost, having an experience of, or having the conditions that invite an experience of simply being able to feel I am safe, even just in this moment,
Mm-hmm.
becoming aware of what happens when you feel unsafe, and even
Mm-hmm.
being able to discern,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm becoming aware that I don't feel totally safe. That process in itself is hugely powerful.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's an either or. There's a paradox. Sometimes we need to be in an environment that's safe in order to start to become aware of a sense of safety in ourselves. And sometimes we need to find some sense of safety in ourselves, and then we can translate that out. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg.
Mm.
But in the embodiment work that I do, the movement medicine work, a large part of that is an invitation to gently be curious and have an environment where we're invited and have some maps to start to come back into the body, which is for sure a huge part of what's needed,
Mm.
if we're going to get any, if we're going to work with and develop a sense of safety. You know, Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, is a beautiful book speaking to the importance of coming home to our bodies
Mm.
before we try and go out
Mm.
to change, to do anything different.
We can be very disembodied, can't we? I mean, I think that's probably true whether or not people have huge levels of, say, complex trauma in their background. But even now with COVID, I find my body's really heavy and quite achy. And now I've become so much more aware of tuning into this over the last few years. But I imagine lots of people don't really stop to think, why might they have new aches and pains or tummy aches, or you know, why their bodies are responding in particular ways. You know, do they know they feel unsafe, for example, or do they even have that vocabulary, because it's not taught in schools?
Exactly. No, and as you know, said beautifully before, you know, there's a level of our collective trauma and disconnect. For example, using your example of the immigration in the US, you know, if you're not on, if you're disconnected from the lands you come from and the people that you've descended from, it's not that it's not possible to be embodied in that, but there needs to be a level of awareness. And depending on how that separation happened, you know, some people move forward and can move around the world with a very intact sense of who they are and where they've come from. But that I think, and the land that you're living on, how connected, whether it's your ancestral lands or otherwise, how do I connect to here, this moment, this place? And we, in our industrial age and in our, there's a lot of that's been very interrupted in us and doesn't foster a sense of being embodied.
Yeah, and just on the immigration issue, I guess as well, how welcomed you feel. You know, are your gifts welcomed by the country that you now find yourself in? Can you play a role? Can you contribute? Do you feel safe? And I know from some of the things I've read, certainly, and people I've spoken to over recent times, people of African origin or from other countries don't necessarily feel super safe and welcome here in Ireland, for example, or in the States. In many countries are experiencing similar things. The legacy of colonialism and what that has meant is challenging for people who've been there for generations, but new people coming, there's a lot to work through, isn't there, really?
Absolutely. And there's, you know, there's why you left. You know, sometimes people just want to go somewhere else, but often not. You know, often people leave because they don't feel they have a huge amount of choice. So there's whatever your leaving story is, and then there's whatever your arriving story is. And if both of those are not very positive, you know, you can understand how people would end up very overwhelmed. Not feeling very resourced and very vulnerable. And then, you know, put that in motion down through generations, and things get very entrenched.
Indeed. I'm just thinking as well, Catherine, about the recent report in Ireland on the mother and baby homes and the treatment of women and girls and infants in Ireland. And the complicity of church, state, and in some cases wider society. Do you think as a nation that Irish people need to face this historical trauma kind of head on, and if we do, why, and do we need again to be resourced in this, or how do we resource ourselves and those most affected?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, again, the simple answer is yes, of course, we need, you know, we need to know our stories on all the different levels, because they're in us, quite literally. And I was speaking recently to Barrow Donovan, who's a biological archaeologist, and who's been speaking and doing some to the mother and baby home issue a bit recently. And part of what he was sharing with me is that, you know, this notion of certain children sort of not being very desirable goes back further than the mother and baby homes, you know, and that was an eye-opener to me,
right?
You know, that, oh, so what is the context in which this kind of thing can happen? And I'm not making any excuses, you know, and mercy to all those affected, impacted, and all of us are, of course. And we need to understand, I think, how did this come to be?
Mm.
What were, I don't believe that every single person involved was an evil person.
Mm.
That's
Mm.
not my experience of how bad things happen, and it's not what history teaches us. How we become so separated
Mm.
from the humanity in another is generally part of a much bigger story.
Mm.
And I think it behooves us to put atrocities like what happened in many of the mother and baby homes into a context that helps us to understand the bigger story, because I think that's the only way we can learn from it.
Mm.
How is it that a group of people can end up
Mm.
in this kind of reality, perpetuating this kind of reality?
Mm.
And I think understanding the bigger context within which these things happen um, enable that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, because otherwise our only option is shame and shadow. These
Mm.
evil people did this,
Mm.
and that's not us.
Mm.
That
Yes.
polarizing, I think, is dangerous.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There was one person I had an exchange with on Twitter who very much wanted to lay the responsibility completely with the state and the church for this. I suppose to do with the policing of women's bodies, and that babies within wedlock were the only ones really protected within the family structures or whatever. He didn't want wider society to have any role in this.
Mm.
But of course, the public vote in politicians, and the public were part of the church. Families were part of the church. It was all quite interconnected and stifling for a very long time. And there was no scope for criticism, no scope for speaking up. I mean, I remember being a child in the 80s with the Kerry babies case. I don't know if you were in Ireland then, Catherine, but it was a country still with a lot of guilt and shame around female sexuality and acting out of what was the norm. And we're still grappling with it. But I think a lot of people would like to say that was the distant past. Those who are not directly affected,
Sure.
who've not been born in a mother and baby home, or who knew someone, would just say that's long ago. Ireland is a different place now. We've had marriage equality, repeal the 8th Amendment, different time, forget about it kind of thing. It's not the ancient past though, is it? I mean, as an ancestral healer.
Yeah, no, not by a long shot. And again, taking any of these things and sort of compartmentalizing them, that was awful, but it's over and we'll put it over here, doesn't acknowledge the progression of that which is resolved. And some things are different, thank goodness. But a lot of things aren't. I've been working with survivors of sexual abuse since the very early 90s, and I would love if I could say in the 30 years of my professional life we went from dreadful disclosure, and it was only the mid 90s that some of these systemic abuses in mother and baby homes and orphanages and on and were coming to light in psychiatric institutions. I would love to say I'm so delighted that all my efforts and all of our efforts in that 30 years means we don't have young women or men coming forward who've been victims of horrific sexual abuse and sexual assault, but we're far from resolving these issues. And it behooves us, I think, to really look to our past and include, before the mother and baby homes, the Victorian age, we're post-colonial. Before that, what is our psyche and what are the stories shaping our psyche and our orientation, which is challenging because it's a little bit like a fish coming to know it's wet, right? Like what is the soup we are all in? And that requires us to be able to get the space to reflect and look back and weave to make more sense of this moment. So those are some of the elements of why I think it's important to connect where we are now and who we are now to where we've come from and from whom we have descended, and the stories that are
Yes,
part of that.
indeed, I agree with you. But it's only something I've come to think about very recently, really, and thanks partly to yourself talking about the historical dimension and the ancestors, which we'll talk about a little bit again in a minute. But one of my favorite books, Catherine, as well, is by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. And it was a revelation to me, him describing the healing benefits of things that were, you know, somatosensory body-based activities like yoga, drumming, and dance. And you've mentioned movement medicine, and I've had the benefit of doing it with you. And I especially find it really nice in a group in real life, you know, when there's this energy exchange between people. But can you tell me a little bit more about what is movement medicine? Like, what's the sort of theory behind it, or the neurobiology behind it, and how does it actually work to benefit in dance?
So movement medicine is a modality that was created by Susanna and Yakov Darling-Kahn, who were apprenticed to Gabrielle Roth, who was the founder of Five Rhythms, another embodiment dance movement practice. So they worked under her tutelage for, I think, almost 20 years, and then came up with these maps and tools. Movement medicine is rooted in psychology, psychotherapy, Gestalt psychotherapy in particular, shamanism, that sort of more indigenous wisdom, and the tradition of ecstatic dance and movement. And for me, when I discovered movement medicine, you know, I had been a psychotherapist and psychologist for many years. But I was also involved in other things. I had my own spiritual journey. I was also a permaculturist who had been growing vegetables and attuned to the seasons and the ways in which, you know, my people had observed those changes in seasons. And in movement medicine, it felt like a lot of that came together. Because the very core of the practice is to bring your attention to your body, and with the support of some facilitation and some good music, invite your body into movement. You know, Gabrielle Roth, who's a sort of the grandmother of movement medicine, would say, put the body in motion and the psyche will follow. We are born and designed to move. People have moved to music as far back as humans have gathered been together, whether, you know, two rocks on a stone or people move. Rhythm is innately part of who and what we are. And so bringing people together with a shared intention of support and to give space to connect to that essence, that part of us that is unbroken, untouched by our traumas and our histories and our stories, our essence, and invite that to simply move in whatever way is right for your being in that moment, and to build that capacity, that permission, does put things in motion. You've probably heard me say, when I'm explaining movement medicine to new students, I often say, for me, finding this practice after years of working psychotherapeutically was like finding extra gears, other ways of getting a little bit more resource, a little bit more support, and deepening my connection with my own body and my own spirit, strengthening my own capacity to know my own yes, my own no, my own rhythm, like bringing me more into alignment with myself. And as you say, when we get to do that with other people in that shared support in a good container, it's extraordinary. In my experience, you know, I've often said it's one of the most beautiful jobs in the world to be standing there, you know, playing and offering some music and some instruction, and in front of me just watching people unfold in the way we do in movement. It's like our essence starts to come more to the fore and occupy. Yakov Darling Khan would say, inhabit your body, inhabit your real estate.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, it will be colonized. There's plenty of ideas and notions out there waiting to kind of take up room, own it, so that it's aligned with your truth. And I don't know if that explains.
No, it's great. And having done it, I mean, I think I met you at an event that I organized that one of your colleagues spoke at, and that's where I heard about movement medicine first. And then it was after Stephen Porges's class that we both took in polyvagal theory. I was going, yes, I'm going to do it. It sounds intriguing.
Well done.
I keep banging on about yoga and body-based modalities. I should really try one. And it is very special. But particularly when there are other bodies there with you, and you can feel energy shift in yourself and others. It's quite special to see that.
And tuning into that support, when a group of people come together and say, okay, let's see, let's give this some room. And we do that together in an environment that's held and safe. It's extraordinary how much momentum is there for us to just become more of who we are. And it's amazing how little support it takes. One of the things that I will often say in a class is, let's just all together give ourselves one yes, just yes to yourself, and then maybe yes to one another. And it changes the whole.
It does.
Like, when we understand it, how do we support one another? How do we say yes to you and all that you are, in your complexity, and the parts of you that are amazing and the parts of you that are a mess? How do we include all that and say, yes, I see you, and let's keep working on the project? When we get that, it actually becomes relatively simple to help one another. To become more of who we are. It's those core kind of conditions, when they're present, make an enormous difference. Enormous.
And just the little glances at people sometimes, and the small smiles and stuff. It's very, very nice. Even on screen now, virtually, it's lovely, and it is a support. But you just don't, for me, you don't feel the transfer of energy in quite the same way, which how could you? Because the bodies aren't in the same space together. One thing as well that I think is interesting is the use of blankets. It seems people can get quite cold, can they? During the process, is that something to do with the nervous system, Catherine, in the dance, in real life, that they might want to cover themselves at a particular point?
You mean as like, I mean, I think, for sure. I mean, the nervous system is involved in everything. It's just always there. So I think several things happen in the dance that could result in that. One, we generally take a journey, where we warm the body up. You'll know the Awakening the Dancer. We kind of check in with all the different parts of the body and give that part of the body to the dancer. A way of orienting to really that essence that we're inviting to take the lead, that part of us that is unbroken. And then we move. And often part of that movement involves, not always, but a certain amount of releasing, something that the body is ready to move through and let go. And then in the returning, and the sort of coming back to baseline, if you will, because just like after a run, if you've moved a lot, your body temperature might drop. But also there's something about sometimes the tenderness that can be present emotionally, moving through something, releasing something, becoming aware of something, connecting in more deeply, maybe emotionally, than you've had the opportunity to do in your busy life, can open us up to a tenderness of heart. And I think blankets and safety and
Mm.
warmth are part of soothing, that enable us to know we're safe and support the process of integration and really receiving the benefits of whatever you may have just moved through.
Yeah. Normally, I personally don't get very cold because I'm quite a hot person. But what I have found, I started doing trauma releasing exercises. There was a free course that a guy made for COVID related anxiety. And I do sometimes get chilly at the end of that, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Hence my question about the coldness is that you know, to do with shedding something or a release.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as we move through these processes, lots of different things can, you know, some people can get very hot.
Mm.
Some people can get very cold. If we're releasing shock in particular, you know, we know in shock the body temperature will drop.
Mm-hmm.
So I think more importantly is to know that it's good to pay attention to
Yes.
what's true for you and what's needed, what soothes you. Some people, the notion of being wrapped up in blankets and with a hot water bottle and a cup of tea is, you know, that's bliss. That's
Yeah.
exhale, that's safety. For other people, that would just be like claustrophobic. That's my
Yeah.
nightmare. You know, let me go outside. I need to get out and step out into the garden or go for a walk or get some air. It's quite personal.
Yeah.
What's happening in your body, and I think rather than getting specific, I would really want to encourage people to pay attention.
Yeah.
What do you need now? Do you need a blanket and a cup of tea and a hot water bottle or a warm bath? Do you need to step out onto the earth and feel the spaciousness of the air? Do you need to feel the sun on your face or on your back? Do you need a hug? What
Yeah.
do you need a little bit of time to yourself? Do you need to just rest?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What
Tune into
soothes you?
yourself.
Exactly. Track and follow your rhythm, your needs. And the more we train ourselves to be paying attention at that level, the better able we are then to know when we're getting overwhelmed for whatever reason, when something is getting too much. It's part of the reason in the dance, I would often say there's all kinds of permission. Whatever I invite you to do, the most important thing is you follow what's right for you, your rhythm. And that's part of the practice of movement medicine, is learning to keep tracking your own rhythm and your own truth. It's fun, and it can be great to become part of a wave of a group of us,
Yeah.
you know, all doing this movement. Beautiful. And on the other side of that spectrum, to know, and sometimes my dance or my movement is very different to what the majority of other people are doing. And that's important to be able to discern. And ideally, sometimes you join in and sometimes you're separate.
But I've heard you say that if you're there, you're always part of the dance, even if you're not dancing, even if your dance is really small or barely discernible, you're still part of the dance. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, you know, in real time when we dance together, I always have a little bed rest nest space set up on the side, because sometimes our energy drops and we need to, you know, what's true for me is I need to just take a rest. And of course, the person who's resting is still part of the whole. In the same way, you know, that ideally people on the edges are still part of the whole in whatever way. Just because we're having a different experience doesn't mean that we're not a very valuable part of what's happening. So yeah.
Yeah. And then there was I think it possibly was my last in-person session, or there might have been one after, but when I submitted my PhD, it was the winter solstice night, and that was an amazing dance. It was about 3 hours long, and really kind of I don't know what I say, it felt to me like it had a pagan aspect to it, but like even though it was in a hall, a school hall, it did have something from the past in it. Can you tell me a bit about the significance of solstice and the equinox, because you tend to hold events on these occasions. And what is the role of the ancestors in that celebration, if any?
Yeah. I mean, I call that current series Sacred Rhythms for that reason. And they're dances that happen on all 8 of the quarters and cross quarters of the year. And part of that has resonated with me, and I've been holding those dances for several years now, because, you know, it's another rhythm. The changing and turning of the seasons are rhythms that people have honored since the beginning of time, because different things happen. You know, we can all identify within the dead of winter, we're a little bit more internal, we're probably indoors a bit more, we're a little bit more maybe reflective, as opposed to the height of summer, the summer solstice, right? Where the longest day of the year, when the energy is much more outside and the sun, right? We have these in this part of the world, we have these long days with very little darkness. And so attuning to, noticing, paying attention to those rhythms, for me, helps us to become aware of the fact that we have rhythms, that things do change. And of course, those rhythms are reflected inside as well as out. I mean, you know, we just changed our clocks forward, and I find in the brighter, longer days, it's easier for me to get up earlier. You know, this time of year, I can get up for a walk and take my dog first thing, and I really enjoy it. Ask me to do that, you know, at the end of November, and I'll be like,
no thanks.
Right? In the same way that, you know, the trees lose their leaves in autumn, and in winter, the sap comes down deep into the base of the tree, and then in spring starts to run up and down the trees, and then sends out leaves, and then fruits and blossom and fruits and seed. And so those rhythms and paying attention to them help me and help us to remember that we are creatures of rhythm. And our ancestors, for all kinds of reasons, one, because you needed to know when to put food in the ground, when to harvest it, how to store it, what were you going to live on in the months when there wasn't so much growing. Like, those rhythms are essentially innate to survival, right? I mean, we get to go to the supermarket and get a mango or an avocado kind of whenever we want now, right? We don't grow avocados in Ireland. What's going on? I mean, I love an avocado, but what does grow here, and when does it grow, and how does it grow? And, you know, how often have children looked at, you know, potatoes, and adults at potatoes coming out of the ground and having no idea? So that connection or disconnect, all those different subtle layers of coming back into connection, help, in my opinion and experience, help us get a little bit more resourced and remember that we're part of something bigger.
Yes.
We're part of the seasons, the exact same chemistry that's in the soil and in the waters and in the air and in the fire and the sun is in us. You know, our cells burn glucose. Our bones are made up of the same elements that you find in the soil. I recently became aware that all the water in the planet is the same water that's been here. Like, there's a finite amount of water on the planet. So the saliva in my mouth is water that has been here for millennia, right? So it's like, whoa, we're actually made up of what's been here for generations and so that water that I'm watching flow in the river where I walk my dog could have been the saliva of my ancestors. Could have been. It's finite. It you know, it just cycles around,
replenishes itself somehow.
After all these years, yet still blowing my mind. And it's like, isn't it interesting that I didn't know that we somehow that I was disconnected from that. And my sense of connection, like imagine if these droplets are droplets that somehow my great, 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 great grandmother
Yeah.
had some connection with.
It is kind of amazing.
And it's like that perspective, as we start to open to it, really can change everything. I'm no longer just me having to get done what I need to get done. I am part of everything. And for me, that A, takes a lot of pressure off.
Right.
B, has me feel like, oh, wait a minute, I can lean into some of this. I'm more just trying to find my rightful place, part of something much bigger, rather than on my own, in my own brittle, pulling on only what I have inside me to make things happen. That's exhausting. I certainly can find it exhausting. Where if I feel and experience myself in a larger context of spring, for example, you know, in my garden right now, it's springtime as we speak, the tulips are coming. Like just to see that process and the beauty that came in a space in my garden where 6 weeks, even a month ago, there was nothing.
There's nothing,
you wouldn't even know what was happening under the ground. And just reflecting on those rhythms really helps me to reflect and to go easy on myself, trusting in the rhythm of change.
It's really fascinating because certainly prior to doing any reading on these things a few years ago, that would all have struck me as very dippy hippie somehow, you know, and I don't mean that in any disrespectful
no,
way.
I agree with you. I feel similarly.
Yeah.
It's been a real struggle for me. You know, any of my dear ones will tell you, you know, how do I, because I think it's unfortunate that this notion of us remembering who we are and what we're connected to has kind of been relegated to the hippy dippy. But I hear you. And I share some of that difficulty, and it's partially why it feels important to kind of make that bridge to how it's actually just very, very ordinary, and how our ancestors lived out of necessity for generations and generations.
But also it strikes me as kind of the rational part of our mind insisting that we, you know, be future focused, that we think about ourselves and our progress, and again, not focus on hundreds or thousands of years ago over which we have no control, and what do we know about it anyway, you know, that it's kind of also part of the individualistic mindset that the West is in, and whereas more indigenous cultures have held on to that connection with the earth and the seasons and animal life. I mean, Native Americans I always find very special when I hear them just talk about stories or the connection to the soil and that type of thing. Is your work on the ancestors, because I really like how you'll invite us to call on our wise and well ancestors. I didn't know what it meant, you know, for a long time, and still learning, but are those the people literally that have who are connected to us, but we have literally no memory of, we have no stories for maybe, but who are still somehow part of us, and their stories have helped create who we are maybe?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd want is, you know, when you were talking about that individualistic, or I'd call that an individualistic wound,
right?
To be honest, because I think it is that. I think it is a wound when we perceive ourselves in isolation and separate, alone from everything. And I think it has a lot to do with a lot of the anxiety and the mental health difficulties that we're seeing in our culture, in our young people. Because there is this perception that we are all alone, which I don't think meets humans and our psyches well at all. I don't think that's how we're designed to orient. As part of that, so in with regard to your question of our wise and well ancestors, that's language that I got from Daniel Four, who is the founder of this modality, ancestral lineage healing, ancestral medicine. And as Daniel explains it, you know, the wise and well ones are those that have been elevated. So he would say one of the principles of ancestral lineage healing work is that all of the dead are not equally well, in the same way that all
Sure.
of the living are not equally well, right? So when we orient to the ancestors, we want to orient to the wise and well ones, those
Yeah.
that have kind of made the transition from being embodied and living to dying to moving through whatever process is required in order to become ancestralized, to sort of move through that which needed to be moved through for them to become wise and well ancestors. Now, this process would have been and is honored in pretty much every indigenous culture, including our own. I mean, keeners in our own
Yeah.
tradition. Part of the purpose of keening was to keen for the soul of the dead to help them cross that bridge. And we, you know, keeners were part of our reality here up until very recently, and still exist. There were certain songs to sing. In the Catholic tradition, which is, you know, the month of November, Samhain, the month of All Souls,
Yeah.
was all about lighting candles, making offerings, saying prayers for the dead to help them join the communion, you know, of saints, the wise and well ones. So that notion of dying and transitioning to becoming a well ancestor is very pervasive across the globe. And again, the more disconnected we become from our traditions and our rituals and our processes, the more disconnected we become from the dead. My experience in the ancestral lineage healing work is it's like it's another circle, right? It's another circle of connection and possibility, where if you come into relationship, awareness, and connection with those from whom you descend and orient to the well ones, there is an abundance of information, support, love. There's just a huge amount of resource there at our backs to inform us and support us in the here and now. And part of that is honoring that maybe not everybody we've descended from has quite made that transition. And part of the work is connecting with those who are well on any given lineage, and through a very relatively simple process, asking that those wise and well ones continue to bring that good energy, that healing, that prayerfulness through the lineage, supporting those who maybe have not as yet crossed that threshold to being wise and well. How do we turn up the volume and help that? And clear some of the wounding, some of what is not yet well, to heal, and take some of the pressure off, maybe some of the impact of that off the living, and turn up the volume on the resource available from those who are behind us, those from whom we have descended.
Do you think people who have, you know, a spirituality in themselves, or who are more aware of their own spirituality and embrace it? Because Ireland, partly because of those scandals in the 90s, the child sex abuse scandals, I know for me as a Catholic child, it was a massive shift in my thinking. And so lots of people of my age and younger now would not have much of a connection to the church or that belief system anymore, which obviously placed a lot more emphasis on whether it's heaven, but certainly the dead and all of that. So does the rupture with a belief system, whether it's Catholicism or any other one, make it a bit more difficult, you think, to tap into the wise and well ancestors? Or can you do, I mean, you can do so whether or not you believe in any?
No, the ancestral lineage healing, repair work, remembering work does not ask any religious belief or disposition. You know, it's not required at all. sometimes what people find hard, and Daniel would speak to this, and as I've done the work with more and more people, it really has touched me. The most difficult thing often for people is to trust what they're experiencing. So when we go through the process of inviting people and creating a container and making it safe, and people connect with their ancestors, it's often relatively easy to get some information, to get a sense of these people, or what you're experiencing, or what. And one of the most challenging things for people is, oh well, or is that just me? Am I making that up? Am I and Daniel would talk to that as a cultural wound. Like,
Right.
why would you think you're making it up? They're right there. People have connected with them for years and years and years, but we don't trust any longer that which we experience that we can't touch.
Right.
And that's a great loss,
Mm.
right? To be able to trust our, some people want to call it intuition, our knowing, the ways in which we receive information. And I'm not saying, you trust absolutely every thought that comes into your head, but there is a little bit of, well, let's trust this and see. Does this make sense? Does this fit? Does this resonate? And often that process of just learning to trust again, our own inner sense of knowing, is a lot of the work. And as we do and learn to discern between, no, that feels true, and no, that feels like noise, or again, that's very empowering, to when someone asks you, can you do this? Will you do that? Are you okay with me doing this? To get to a place where you can listen to your own yes or no, and trust that as right for you, and be able to stand over it. That's a game changer.
Massive.
For being human, particularly for being a woman.
Yeah.
It's a real game changer. So that level of empowerment and connection and relationship, really, with ourselves and our own knowing, our own innate knowing and wisdom, that I believe practicing becoming more embodied, as Bezel so beautifully talks about, really, really strengthens, I think is a game changer for empowerment, for living a life that you find fulfilling and aligned with your own being, your own purpose, and that which then in turn changes your level of confidence, your capacity, and on it goes. Inspiring
Indeed.
others.
Yeah.
Right. So then it branches out.
I was just going to ask you about the importance of boundaries, as you mentioned, the difficulties for women at times of honoring their voice, or what they know they need, but not feeling that they dare say no, let's say. I mean, obviously it's important to say yes to life and yes to responsibility, but we do also need to mind ourselves and know when we're overstretched or know when we're overwhelmed, and we need to take care of ourselves. Is that a learned, like, is that an ancestral wound, or it seems pretty much an ongoing cultural expectation that women still, I mean, for example, with COVID, a lot of women seem to still be bearing the burden of the child care when children are at home while they're working, domestic responsibilities, when there might be a man at home as well who's writing all these papers or focusing on work. Now, I know lots of men are also doing plenty.
Sure.
But
yeah,
how do we learn, given that not everyone goes to psychotherapy or knows about movement medicine or any of these techniques? How do we enable women to have those safe boundaries?
It's a great question. I think I would go back a step to, for sure, and I've worked with women for years and years in all women's groups, and really value those spaces. And I think it's something that we all need to work at. I think for men too, I think the wound manifests maybe differently, generally speaking.
Yeah.
You know, for men, it's often really hard to know what's happening for them or what's true for them. They haven't been socialized even more than women to be connected to what's right for them deeply. They may be socialized to a lot easier say no, or they may not be socialized to be tracking other people's needs in the same way that Irish women in particular, I think, can be. I certainly was to, you know, to orient to caretaking. But it's a wound all the same, even if it's at the other end of the spectrum of disconnecting.
Yeah.
You know, that's a wound too. So I think what I would say is there are several different layers to it. I think supporting our children to understand and know their bodies and how they work, and what a yes, really an embodied yes from your system feels like, and what an embodied no. You know, if your tummy contracts and you find it hard to breathe, and you've got tension in your shoulders, pay attention. That's important feedback. So for our children learning that, and for our adults learning that, in order for our children to learn it, parents need to learn it. So we all, wherever we're starting from, I would say step one is finding ways, sharing ways to bring awareness into children's, into all of our embodied feedback is a baseline, you know, as Resmaa says in his book, in terms of dealing with racism. We need to get in our bodies because we need to get the feedback to get oriented to what needs to happen next. So that's number one. And then the more we do that, you know, we need models. We can't, often as humans, we can't know something until we see it. Like seeing someone, you know, seeing women politicians gives young girls the notion that that's something I could do. In the US, seeing a woman of color as vice president.
Yeah, so important.
You know? Yeah. So seeing, knowing, experiencing people who are in their bodies, are breaking those glass ceilings, are daring to do things a little bit differently, I think are all things that make things possible. And then how do we collectively create spaces that encourage that? As you say, not everybody's going to go to a movement medicine class, although they're very welcome. Or workshop. They'd love it. You know, come one, come all, for sure. But how do we bring this into systems like schools, like community events, like parenting courses, like the places, like, dare I say it, you know, organized religion, or like structurally, as these things permeate, I think that's how we change culture, which is ultimately the challenge. And as you know, you stated, we've done it in many ways. We have marriage equality, we've repealed the age, so things are changing. And how do we continue to open up spaces for discourse, for education, for experiences that invite people in to remembering how this body works and how we work together?
In terms of improving kind of men's health as well, I'm wondering, do you think by the fact that in mainstream society, I think it's fair to say that emotions are more associated with women. And in fact, we kind of almost denigrate emotions because of that perception, because we all have them and they don't have a gender. They give us important messages about, you know, our bodies. As you say, do we feel happy, or are we frightened, or why are we angry? They're telling us something. But I suppose because they're seen as the enemy of reason, that might be partly why we don't honor them perhaps as we might. Are we doing us all really a disservice. And perhaps I'm wrong about this. Perhaps this is just my own thinking. But do we honor emotions enough? And again, is there a place within the school perhaps, and all these other settings, the church setting as well, where we actually realize they're part of what makes life worth living, really? Without them, if we were only reason and survival and no emotions in between, it's kind of, what's the point? It's a bit of a weird question.
No, I think it's a fantastic question. I think clearly, you know, my answer is going to be yes, we need we need our emotions. But I think part of, you know, this again speaks to the bit, you know, oftentimes people will turn up in therapy and say, I have this big problem with my feelings. And it's like, it's all down to them and they're getting it so wrong. And, you know, you just want to say, dear one, you're part, we, you know, the big picture, all of us collectively are in trouble on this front.
Yeah.
So I think we live in an age, again, where the mind and the rational mind has been lauded. And for all kinds of reasons, you know, religion has had a part in this, organized religion, certain organized religion, you know, industrialization has had a part in this, trauma, for all of these reasons. I certainly grew up with an unchecked assumption. I don't think anybody ever said this to me, but it was certainly modeled that what makes sense is king, right? Like that's what should guide you. And I happen to have been, I was a child who felt things very acutely, and that was problematic. You know, it was problematic for some of the adults in my world that I was experiencing emotions maybe more intensely than was handy or convenient at times. And it took me a long time to sort of unpack and come into better relationship with my emotional responses, to really feel more anyway that they're in their rightful place. As I mean, emotions have a function, right? Anger usually tells us something has been transgressed, there's a boundary, something is not okay, and we get the energy to restate it. Now, of course, that can get very confused and convoluted if your emotional well-being has gotten kind of clogged up, right? I often talk to people about emotions being energy, and think of it like as a plumbing system, right? So things need to flow through the system. If a certain emotion isn't allowed, or too much, you know, you were told that how you experience things emotionally was too much, things get like shut down, and then there's like a backlog and a clog. And if you open the valve at all this pressure can come through. So for many of us, that emotional, rightful, healthy flow of being able to cry about something, let it go, and then it being done, you know, being able to be in sort of right relationship to those emotions and their expression gets tricky, because culturally we're a little skewed around that. So understanding that emotions are energy, and they're also feedback, they're responses, right? Tears and grief are around losing something that mattered to us. Joy is a wonderful, you know, life-giving experience. It really tells us we're in alignment, we're opened up to life, our life force is flowing. Fear, again, really important feedback. Pay attention, something is not quite right? And of course, some of these things can get stuck, or if there's too much of something, again, if the system isn't flowing, they can become problematic, as we see with a lot of people in anxiety in these days, where there's a lot of fear that hasn't been able to find a channel or get acknowledged so that we can move through it. So yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do about befriending and not being afraid of our feelings. And again, having good models. Like where do we find a really good, healthy model for anger? Anger is very important. Anger isn't the problem. Pent up anger that we have that has become contorted or distorted, or that's, you know, that we're associating with aggression. Anger equals aggression. Anger doesn't, in its rightful place, doesn't equal aggression. It just equals knowing and being able to say no,
Yeah.
stop, not okay.
Mm.
And then ideally, when we've communicated that and we've moved through the situation, then it's discharged and gone. We don't need
Mm.
to hold on to it. But we don't have very many healthy models for what
No.
that looks like in women or men.
Yeah.
So it gets tricky to come into that right relationship when it's been very distortive, maybe for many generations. And things like colonization, a famine, a
Mm.
genocide, civil war, will do a lot to
Mm.
distort these things and to clog up those systems. Sorry.
Yeah, and I suppose for short-term coping, it can be really handy from an adaptive point of view to batten down the hatches and not feel these things for a while.
That's essential sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes that's essential. This is too much. I cannot go there right now.
Mm.
There's a reason why in grief, people, in a significant bereavement, often people are in shock and can't start processing the grief for a while.
Mm.
That's actually a very smart inbuilt mechanism to ensure we don't blow the system, that not too much gets activated and sent through the system at once that we couldn't cope with. However, it's also important we don't get stuck there, that there's enough support and resource so that freeze can start to thaw, and in manageable doses, we can process something like, for example, the grief of a significant bereavement.
We're nearing the end now, Catherine, and thank you so much for sharing this wonderful insights with me. I knew it was going to be fascinating. Just one final one about policy. And I know this is not your normal focus, but what kind of areas do you think it might be worth looking into, for policymakers, in terms of if they were to tune into this discussion, what might they usefully focus on in terms of trying to right some of the wrongs in the world, or shift the energy in a positive direction? Because there's a lot of negative energy and fear out there right now, as there always is, I suppose, but with COVID and some of the instability in various countries, it's at quite a high level. So what would you focus on?
I mean, I think we probably need to focus on a few different areas simultaneously, as shifting anything significant requires. For sure, I think education, and how, looking at how our education systems can include helping children to come to know their being and how it works. So encouraging things like embodiment and experiences of embodiment. Some of this is starting with mindfulness in schools, and education that helps us to understand we are all different, and how do we deal with difference, the richness of difference. I mean, in my own work, that's a topic that's really coming up. How do we embrace more, build our tolerance for our own places where we might find ourselves different to how we think we should be? And in return, how do I orient to the difference in another, and building capacity there? And I think that starts with becoming more embodied, listening to the feedback from our systems, and then having support in building relational muscle to be able to navigate that with others. I think safer spaces where people are getting heard. We are storytellers by design. Part of why therapy works is people get to tell their story and have it heard and received from their perspective as they experience it, and have that honored and acknowledged. So creating spaces where people get heard, and where leaders, part of what we ask of leaders is that they model how to navigate and hold difference, rather than shaming people or falling into the right and wrong of things, the good and the bad, those polarities that are those binaries that are just not helpful in expanding our understanding and our ability to be with and include one another. So those would be the two first things that come to mind.
And just on the holding spaces for people and letting them tell their story. What I was asking Stephen Porges about this, because he says listening is a co-regulatory activity that changes neural state. And so I was asking him, you know, there are limited psychotherapists in the world, limited trauma-informed mental health practitioners, whether they're psychiatrists or psychologists. And I just wanted to know, can ordinary people like me play a role in giving people space to tell their story if they want to? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's part of our human condition. You know, I would love, I don't know if this will happen in my lifetime, but to live to see a point where we don't need psychotherapy in the way that it's used today. It's like, I'm in trouble and I need to talk about something. And for sure, we all need guides at time, myself included. I'd still go into the therapy room to, but it's a way of being. Orienting relationally, honoring one another's story, hearing one another. There's none of us that can't benefit from developing our capacity to do that for one another. It's not going to be everybody's first thing.
No.
But for sure, you know, Irv Polster, who was my Gestalt trainer, who I was saying to you earlier, is about to turn 99 and just wrote his last book in December at 98 years of age. The passion of the last quarter of his life, and may there be many more years, but has been taking the principles of psychotherapy and applying them much more broadly in the world, because these principles of listening, hearing one another, being able to accurately reflect one another, calming down enough to be able to stay in that dialogue and navigate difference, are needed in the world way beyond the therapy room. So in this next stage of my own professional life and my personal life, it is my intention to be curious and to endeavor to hold spaces that invite people to experience that, so that they are developing that capacity in themselves when they leave the space to share. May it be so.
May it be so indeed. Well, Catherine Dunne, thank you so much for taking the time on this lovely sunny Friday to talk to me. This has been How to Talk Policy and Influence People with me, Jane Mulcahy, and my guest was the wonderful Catherine Dunne. Thanks so much,
Thank
Catherine.
you so much, Jane. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
And your work is amazing. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.